Okay, so our next one's out the freezer, and exactly as before, we just start with one corner, and if all goes well, that corner will come up quite well. If you find that you're getting too much bend and not being able to do it, you can always move on to the next corner. It's the paper you want to pull away rather than the icing, because it's the icing that will tear. But as you can see here, we've got our corner, so I'm just going to lay this flat on the surface and I'm going to work. So I'm just going to lay this flat on the surface, and I'm just going to work, hold the fondant gently with my thumb and work the backing paper away. I'm pushing down on top of it and just gently pulling away. Keep a little bend or loop in it to keep the pressure on the icing so it stays flat on the surface. And we've then got our photo, and we can add this to the cake in much the same way as we did before. Just going to get roughly the right position. And add our water. And we're going to start on one edge. Just gently push that down. If you get any tears, you should be able to, as long as you start on one edge, you should be able to hide that quite well, because even here there's a tiny little tear, and if you just gently work that down and make sure there's some water underneath, it will stick down quite easily. So here we have our photos in place, and we'll add our message in next, which Danielle's working on over here to the left. And we're almost there. This is obviously quite a basic, easy to make cake, but it can be quite effective, and there's lots of different ways of doing this sort of cake. I'm sure we'll get around to showing you those at some point. Okay, so we're going to put our lettering on. That's the next step. So I'm just going to very carefully manoeuvre this into position, so I can get a rough idea of where I want it all. I'm just going to put the happy at the top here. So now I've got the top line okay, and I can work out the rest of it quite easily without having to put it all onto the cake. But this will just make sure our writing is right in the middle. So our happy there in the centre, as you can see, and then we'll just put our 40th underneath along with anniversary. I might just move it up a little bit and have it overlapping slightly. So I'm going to start doing that now. So all I do is just very carefully slide the fondant down, add a little bit of water in the shape of the letter. Be careful not to move it around the cake too much, otherwise you end up with smudges in the colour of the fondant. There's a little bit of movement there, so you can move it slightly. And you don't want too much water, just enough to get it to stick. Just pay attention to making sure it's straight, because there is no going back once these are on, without making a mess of the arse in. Just stand back a little bit, just make sure it still looks right. And then put our last letter on here, on the end. And as you can see, I've got a happy on. It's just slightly overlapping the edges, and we can move on to the next one, and that's going to be, so we can move on to the next one now, and that'll be a 40 and a TH for 40th. Okay, so we've got the 40th to do now. We can want to try and put this into the middle of these with this letter in. So get this roughly in position, bearing in mind that we've got T and a H to go on the end. You'll notice these numbers are a little bit bigger. A bit of a delicate process trying to lift these numbers on, and if they break like that, don't worry too much. You can correct our mistake in a moment. Just carefully push it into place. You're going to want a few of these different sorts of templates, lettering templates. You can do some bits by hand, but some of the fancy lettering, it's just not worth trying to do them all by hand. It takes far too much time doing it that way. Plus, it doesn't look as good as using the little press templates that we've got here. So just push those onto the fondant, and then you can cut around the edges if they don't release very well. Once you've made the initial investment, you won't have to buy lots and lots of these. It's just the initial outlay that costs a little bit. And then after that, it'll just be your cake supplies and boards and things like that that you need if you're making lots of these sorts of cakes. Okay, so we've got our happy and our 40th in place. And then we can add our anniversary underneath. So obviously this is quite a long word, anniversary. So I'm going to just carefully position it in place first, just to make sure it's central on the cake. If you're feeling confident, you can skip this step and just go for it, but it's just make sure that we've got even space either side. Obviously be careful if your fondant's a little bit sticky still, which can be the case if you've got a warm room. just stick exactly where you put it straight away, and you won't be able to move it. So already I can see I've not quite got enough space there, so I'm just going to move it all along a little bit. Like so. And then even now it's not quite right, but that will be okay because we can just move this up a little bit now, and then we can push our letter into place. So just exactly the same way as before. Just use a little dab of water and go around the shape of the letter that you want to stick on next. So that you don't end up with loads of little wet patches all over the cake. Obviously you want to make sure you've got your spellings right, so before you even begin putting it on the cake, just make sure that you've double checked. If you're not good with spelling, just double check on the computer or a dictionary. It's always better to play safe. Be sure that you spelled something right, especially if you've got a customer paying for it. Friends and family tend to be a bit more forgiving, but customers might not necessarily be very happy if you misspell somebody's name. Okay, so we can now take a closer look. And we're not far off being done. Just got a Rose and Malcolm to put down to the board, and then we're just going to finish it off with a few finishing touches and we'll be done.